Hello friends. Hello friends. You welcome to my complete Java course. So today video lecture is the continuation of my previous video. So in these videos we are going to learn exception handling in Java. So let's start today video lecture. So today we are going to learn exception handling with method overriding in Java. Means if we are overriding the methods, then how to handle the exception in the overridden method. Okay, so let's start. What is the overridden method? We learn in the upcoming videos in detail, where we learn the polymorphism, because method overloading and method overriding is the concept of the polymorphism. So we learn in detail about the method overloading and method overriding. Here just we look how to handle the exception within the method overriding. So there are many rules if we talk about method overriding with exception handling. The rules are as follows. Number 1. If the superclass method does not declare an exception, if the superclass method does not declare an exception, subclass overridden method cannot declare the checked exception, but it can be declared unchecked exception. So let's understand this point with the example on Eclipse IDE. So friends, I just create a class, my class. So this class is the parent class. Okay. Here I have defined one method m1, and m1 method is not throwing any checked exception. But now we create a test class which extend my class. So test class is a subclass or child class. It is extending my class, and we are overriding m1 method. Overriding means just write the same method as the parent method, but the body for that method may be different. Okay. Now the subclass method, we are throwing exceptions. Exception is a checked exception. So it is throw the error. It says if you throws if you are not throwing any exception from the parent class method and you are overriding that method in the subclass, then you cannot throw checked exception, but you can throw the unchecked exception. So what is the unchecked exception? Unchecked exception is like a arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, or all the subclasses of runtime exception. So if you define here, so I just define a runtime exception, or I'm throwing the runtime exception. So now it is not showing any error. Or you can define any subclass of runtime exception. Suppose first we try to run. Okay, so here we are throwing only exception, and if we try to run this, let's see what is the output. So now we create a test class object and call the m1 method. As you try to run this program, you will get a compile time error. Yes, you will get the compilation problem, unhandled exception type exception. Okay, now what we will do, if we change this exception as a unchecked exception. So what is the unchecked exception? Like a runtime exception. Okay, now if you will try to run this program, you will get the output happily. Here you define child class m1 method. So you will get the output child class m1 method. Or you can define any exception which is the subclass of the runtime exception, because the any exception which is subclass of the runtime exception is the unchecked exception. So you can define here arithmetic exception. Also, it will not throw any exception. Okay, now I think you understand the first point. Okay, now understand the second point. Second point says that if the superclass method declares an exception. So if the superclass method declares an exception, if the superclass method declares an exception, subclass overridden method can declare same exception or subclass exception or no exception, but cannot declare the parent exception. So let's understand this point with the example. So now again we are throwing the okay. Now we throw the exception in the parent class. Okay. Now you can see. Now you can see there is no exception in the M1 method. Okay. So if you throw any exception in the parent class method, you can throw the same exception in the child method declaration. Okay. But what happened if you define the throwable? Now you will get the error, because if you define any exception or parent class method throws any exception, in the child class method you can throw only the parent method class exception, or it's a subclass exception, means you can throw in the child class methods only the exception class exception or its subclass. So its subclass is the runtime exception. Now it will not throw any exception, or you can define any exception like arithmetic exception. Also it will not throw any exception. So I think now you got the point, that if you are throwing any exception from the parent class method in the subclass method, you can throw only the same exception which is thrown by the parent class, or you can throw the subclass of the exception which is thrown by the parent class method, or you cannot throw any exception also, then it will not throw any error. Okay, if you are not throwing any exception in the child class, or you are throwing exception in the parent class, also it will not throw any exception. Now if you run this program, it will execute. Okay, so now understand the next point.